Ladies and gentlemen, please give a very big hand to Mr. JB Gill.
Morning. Usually I do a joke about being tucked up ready for your bedtime story, but it's a bit too early for that. So we'll save that one.
Very early.
Morning.
Well, JB, thank you ever so much for coming along this morning. Can we just start? You're going to tell us your life story and the different things that's happened to you. Let's start with your childhood. What was that like?
I had a great childhood, to be very honest with you. I grew up with my younger brother, both my parents, and we've always based in South London. And in my early years, I grew up in the Caribbean as well. So for me, sort of that village mentality and growing up around your family and so on and so forth was very, very close to me. I grew up in church as well. So for the young people here, I had not too dissimilar an upbringing to you. And actually, I attended lots of different churches in my early years. So in the Caribbean, we attended a Pentecostal church, and some of my family members run that and still do to this day. And then my great aunt, who's kind of like my grandmother, because my grandmother passed before I was even born, so I didn't actually get to meet her, but my great aunt kind of took on that role. She didn't have children of her own, and she's been was a child evangelist for a very long time, and unfortunately now she's almost 90, so she's not active in the church anymore, and she's in care, but she was a huge part of my upbringing, as you can imagine, as sort of playing that grandparent role, and certainly on my mother's side of the family, we attended church in my early years, and I went to Church of England primary school. I was involved in Scouts and Cubs and so on, and that was affiliated with a Catholic church. So from quite early on, I spent quite a lot of time in various different churches, and we attended church, as I say, as a family as well, in my early years.
And then when you were 13, you moved to Croydon. Did you still keep going to church after you moved?
To be honest, I think at that sort of time, I was just talking to Steve's wife there. We had... Life was busy, as you can imagine. I just started secondary school. We'd moved house, and I think our connections, whereas we were growing up in my early years, we've been there for a long time, and my parents knew it very well. So we had our church in Dulwich, which is in South London as well, and we had quite a good community network. And when we then moved to Croydon, I was at secondary school. My brother has just started the secondary school as well, which is one of the reasons why we moved. And so life was very, very busy. So we didn't quite have the same connections, and we would go to church, we'd go certainly for I'll say the special occasions, Christmas, Easter, things like that. And, when we weren't sort of busy doing something with school or whatever it might be, we'd certainly go along. But it wasn't as consistent, I'll say, as when I was growing up.
And of course, you had two loves in life, didn't you? You had music and you had sport. Which took the preference?
Well, I've always been very sporty. I've always loved my sport. But also, of course, as you can imagine, music was always quite high up there. And I remember being sort of 7 or 8. I used to play the flute. Well, I started playing the recorder. So anyone who plays the recorder now, or any parents who've got kids who play the recorder, hang in there. But yeah, I started playing the recorder, went on to playing the flute, played the piano, and as you can imagine, I love to sing. So I was always involved in a choir, and it was something that I think has always, been very close to my heart. One of the reasons why I wanted to join a band. I love how sort of music sounds when you sing in unison or you sing with multiple voices. So music was definitely, or has always been, a huge part of my life. But in my sort of teens, I think, when I had to make the choice between music and sport, in those years, I couldn't really understand how I'd make training as a pianist or a flautist work in terms of career. Little did I know that Beyonce takes a flautist on stage with her when she tours. Perhaps I might have stuck with it had I known that. But at the time, I didn't. So I think at that time, sport took over, really.
And of course, you did very well. You played rugby, you played for London Irish, but then you had a very bad injury. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, for those of you who are into your sport, it comes with risk as much as the reward. So, I had my sights set on perhaps a professional career in rugby. In hindsight, it definitely wasn't the right option for me. But it was certainly a dream of mine in my teens, and I remember having the injuries to my ankle. When I came back, I didn't quite play the same, and it was around that time for any teenagers in the audience where you're talking about your career options, and you're doing all those workshops at school and stuff, and it was around the time as well, I think, musically, where I was starting to connect with the music that I loved, and then gone from sort of listening to my parents' music to then, I quite like that sound, and I quite like this stuff, and whatever else, and it was definitely in that period of discovery for me, and I think, I got to grips with the fact that I wouldn't play professional sport, but then it was a case of, okay, what am I going to do? How, what am I interested in? How am I going to sort of, translate that into what comes next?
And of course, you then decided to go to university and study theology. Now, what is theology, and why did you choose that?
It came about because ultimately I wanted to buy time. And so anyone thinking of going to uni, close your ears now. I knew that I was capable of going to university, and to be honest, at that moment, I was pretty set, almost gone full circle, pretty set on a career in music. Somehow. I didn't actually have aspirations to be a singer specifically, but of course that was part of it. And so, I thought, okay, what subject can I do that I'm going to know I'll do pretty well at, probably won't have to work so hard at. But by that time, 2 or 3 years to then sort of, find my way in music. And I absolutely loved theology at school, so not to do it a disservice, I did get an A at A-level, so no excuses. But yeah, it was a subject that I knew very well. I knew I'd do well, and it would give me an opportunity to explore, my real passion, which at the time was my music and the idea of music as a career. So that's why I chose theology. And for those of you who don't know, theology in the Greek is theo and logos, which is the study of the word, which related to Word of God. And so ultimately, it's a study of the Christian faith and the history of Christianity. And there were lots of other modules chucked in there, like Judaism and, of course, the foundation of Christianity and ethics and stuff, which is kind of a bit more current and a bit more right from wrong and stuff that I love, and even today I love debating that sort of stuff, talking about that sort of stuff. And I think as a Christian, it's really healthy to have those conversations with people who understand it and who don't understand it. It's a great way to strengthen your faith. So for me, it wasn't about faith specifically, but it was something that I knew I'd love and enjoy and would allow me the opportunity to pursue my real passions for a career.
And during that time, you joined JLS. Now, how did that all come about?
Well, I just finished my first year at university. I did pass, which is good. And as I say, I was very much focused on, how can I make it within the music industry. So I was working with a vocal coach who's still a good friend of mine, just to develop my songwriting abilities, obviously improve my voice and so on. And, she was working with a couple of other students, and I think they'd entered into the X Factor. So she went with them to the X Factor and obviously waited for them to hear their result or whatever, and met Arishe, who, for those of you who don't know, is the founding member of JLS. And she came back and she said, I met this guy, he's a really nice guy, he's putting this group together, here's his number, if you're interested, he's looking for another member, if you're interested, give him a call and you can always see what happens. And I thought, okay, I'll test it out, I'll see what happens, because as I say, I didn't really have an ambition to join a group or be a singer specifically. Anyway, called Arishe, met Arishe, sang for Arishe, and he was like, yep, I like you, but there's 2 other guys in the group, Aston and Marvin, and, they have to meet you too, and it's a group decision, we'll see what happens. So I met the boys, and that was pretty much it. That was the start of JLS, and yeah, from there, day one, we were in the rehearsal studio working together, and we had no idea what we were rehearsing for, but yeah, obviously that was the start of JLS.
And you applied for X Factor. Why did you do that? What made you go for X Factor?
Well, it's probably about 18 months after sort of that we first formed that we ended up going on the X Factor. And I mean, to be honest, it's hard for a student, you know. The student loan doesn't go that far. So you know, we basically ran out of resources. You know, we'd entered lots of best unsigned act competitions. We'd, you know, been involved in open mic nights, you know, some of which we'd won, some of which we hadn't. You know, met lots of different people, and we wanted to do it sort of the traditional way, the way you hear, you know, sort of historically, where people like, you know, send in this demo tape, and then Simon Cowell picks it up and goes, amazing, call them up, get them in, sign them up, let's go. But it didn't happen like that for us, you know, and I think we were in that era of life where, you know, a lot of these online, or not online, but like these reality TV shows, so to speak, you know, we're really producing talent. I think we entered onto the 5th season of the X Factor, and, you know, I think the 3rd season was Leona's season, and, you know, we all know the success that Leona's had, and, you know, how she was able to go international, and, you know, that was really through the strength of the show. And I think, you know, at the time, of course, you know, a lot of the Simon Cowell shows were you know, massive hits on TV, tens of millions watching and tuning into finals and so on. So we knew it was a good platform. It just, you know, it was always a last resort for us, to be honest. And we took the jump, decided to enter, and the rest, as they say, is history.
So the message is, if you're skint, apply to the X Factor.
Yes. I still don't talk to Alexandra Burke. No, I'm joking. We are actually genuinely great friends. I mean, I was gutted, as you could probably tell from the video. But it was one of those things. Obviously, we got to the final, and we knew that in a final, anything can happen, genuinely. And so, you know, I wanted to win, of course. But I think ultimately our biggest aim, our aim throughout the whole process was to get a record deal, you know. And I think one of the great things, you guys will have seen the show over the years, and, you know, people often say the second place does better, and why is that? You know, I think for us, we had a very strong idea of what we wanted to do, and you know, if we did have our record deal, the music we wanted to make and all that sort of stuff, and we were very unified as a group, and I think that's one of the reasons why we did so well on the show. But then after we finished the show, although we had no idea whether we were going to be signed or what would happen specifically, you know, it was very much get to work, what are we doing, you know, and almost speaking to our management and our agents and so on in that way, you know, which doesn't often happen. I think for a lot of artists, you know, they kind of feel like someone's got to give them the opportunity, but actually you are as much a partner in what you're doing as anybody else. And yes, you might not have the experience, but actually it's your art, it's your craft, and you're able to do what you want with it. So I think that's one of the reasons why we ended up doing so well. And
despite coming second, you guys just went from 0 to hero. You were so well known, and you were under so much demand. How did that affect you, and how did it affect your faith?
Well, I think at that moment, you know, and sort of in the immediate aftermath, it was a lot. It was very much 0 to hero, like you say, but I feel like we were prepared for it. We couldn't imagine what the experience physically would be like, but we had anticipated it, and we knew what we wanted to achieve, and, you know, we felt like this is the chance to do it. And I think for me, it was kind of like jumping onto a hamster wheel. You can keep up with it, but actually, I mean, it's going pretty fast, and you can't get off easily. And I think it was is an element of that. You know, it was something that we wanted to achieve, something we wanted to do, but then, you know, we basically gone from kind of having control and you know, over our own lives and what we did and when we did it and how we did it, to very much being, you know, part of a system, and not in a bad way. I don't think we were ever done, you know, we were hard done by in terms of the system, if you want to call it that. But it was tough because, you know, all of a sudden we're dependent on each other, you know, and it's a relentless schedule, and you're busy all the time, you're traveling all the time, you're away from home for months at a time, you know, and you miss a lot. You know, you miss family weddings, you miss birthdays, you miss funerals even, you know, there's lots of, you know, things that you kind of have to sacrifice in order to keep up with, you know, the demands of obviously that sort of success.
And how did it affect your faith, though?
Well, to be honest, I think at that point, you know, my faith was pretty much non-existent in the sense of you know, personally living it. I would say, you know, it's something that's always been very close to my heart, and whenever I did get a chance, or wherever happen to be at home for the odd weekend of the year, I try and make it to church, or, if, as I say, if I was home for Christmas, you'd definitely go for sort of those occasions. But, there was no real consistency to it. And I think at that time of life, it was very much just going with what I felt was best, and just trying my best to figure it all out. And it's not easy, you can imagine, if you're busy and you have no time as it is, it's hard enough. But then, with all the external pressures and all the other bits and pieces that go on, it's not an easy industry to be able to navigate for anybody, let alone for someone in their early 20s, And I think it was good that we went through that process slightly older. So I'd already been to university, I'd already left home in that sense and, experienced that. But it's not easy. It was tough. And as I say, certainly I wasn't being guided by my faith at that point in life.
And then God gave you a little nudge, didn't he? When you were in Scotland in the tour and you had a couple of visitors. Yeah, well, I got
plenty of nudges along the years. But certainly, one that really stood out, we were traveling, I think we were doing a radio tour, which is effectively how the sort of schedule of the year would work, is you'd release a single. But back then, nowadays, if a song's coming out on today, Sunday the 7th, then it's out today, you can buy it today, and this is the first time you hear it. Back then, you almost had 6 to 8 weeks of lead time. So in that 6 to 8 weeks, that would be your promo weeks. So you'd go to various different parts of the UK, you'd go to various different radio stations, do various different performances and so on, where you would effectively promote the single, and then a date 8 weeks later would be the release date, and in that week you probably do sort of your live shows like Graham Norton, Alan Carr, all that sort of stuff, Jonathan Ross or whatever, and then that was it. The song was out, and you kind of had a bit more downtime. And so for us, we'd go and do these radio tours all the time and be on the road for a few weeks, and we went up to Scotland. And as you can imagine, loads of fans will always come and try and find us somewhere. How they find out, I don't know to this day. But they'd come and they'd find you, and they'd give you loads of presents, lots of sweets and cuddly toys and things like that. Some presents we won't mention right now, but anyway. But no, these girls gave me a bag, and they said, oh yeah, here you go, a present for you. And I went to look inside, and they were like, no, don't open it now. I'm thinking, right, okay. Open it in your hotel room. I'm like, okay, that's going back. No, I kept it, and they said, open it in your hotel room. So I went into my hotel room that night and opened it up, and there was a covering letter in there. So I read the letter, and long story short, it said something like, we've been praying for you in our youth group. We've heard, a couple of times you sort of mentioned about your faith, or, to be honest, I don't even know what they took it from, but they'd obviously heard me talk about something or the other. And so we felt really cool to give you this gift, and we hope that it will help you, on your journeys. And I looked in the bag, and it was a Bible, which wasn't shocking to me. I think they were quite nervous to find out how I would receive a gift like that, because that's quite a bold statement, I think. And of course, they're quite young girls. I was only in my early 20s, so they were definitely younger than that. And it wasn't a shock to me, because obviously I've grown up in church, I've got plenty of Bibles myself, even though I perhaps wasn't using them as much as I do today. But, and I'd studied theology, so I wasn't unfamiliar with that. But really, for me, it was kind of just a statement, certainly a divine statement, to just say, what's important. As much as you're busy and you're doing all this stuff and that's all amazing, actually, this is... this is the foundation. This is your foundation. So you need to reconnect with that. And it was really nice for them to reach out. And, we talk about faith and, taking steps of faith. Those girls, as I say, went out on a limb, for want of a better term, for someone that they really look up to, that perhaps is on a pedestal, that's maybe untouchable or whatever. It's definitely in the public eye. And they had no idea how I'd react, but they took a leap of faith and they gave me that gift. And as I say, it was a real sort of trigger point for me to reconnect with my faith.
And the lovely thing was, years later, we went up to Scotland, didn't we? And
yeah.
we took a meeting like this in their church, and they led it, which was absolutely great, and really brought it all back to you again, didn't it? That was absolutely lovely. Now, about that this time, you met your wife, Chloe, who's a dancer, wasn't she? How did you meet her?
We met on the X Factor. So the X Factor is very powerful in our household. It was her first commercial job. And so she was a dancer on week 6 of the series that we did. And I don't know what it was. There's obviously something in the water that week, because we'd had dancers prior to that, and there'd never ever been a similar spark. But yeah, no, it was great because obviously Chloe understands the industry, and you know, we were both sort of starting on, you know, our own path, our own journey, you know, and being ambitious and obviously making it in our chosen fields. And it was nice to be able to firstly share that with somebody, but then also, you know, she never danced for us, so it was nice to be able to go and watch her do her things and dance for whoever she was dancing for at the time, and similarly, you know, it would allow her the opportunity to come and support and watch our shows as well. So, and you know, we tended to work on a lot of the same shows. So like with the Brits you saw there, you know, we were doing the Brit Awards together, but not, you know, with each other. We did the Mobos together, T4 on the beach, a lot of those sort of, you know, summer shows and festivals and stuff. So it was nice to be able to, you know, certainly in those early years, to have someone to be able to share those experiences with, but then also support each other at the same time.
JLS had come to an end in 2013, and you were now starting to do various TVs. You also became a farmer, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But, I mean, as you left JLS, as life settled down a bit, how did your faith come back to you? How did you find it again?
Well, I mean, as I say, it's always really been a part of my life, and I think a lot of it was more down to consistency. And I think when Chloe and I were thinking about getting married and you know, having those discussions about, you know, what do I want our lives to look like? Are we going to have children? All those sorts of things that, you know, most couples will get to when they're at that stage of their relationship. And I think for me, that was kind of, as you say, coming towards the end of JLS, and you know, I definitely had a few more triggers along the way as well. And you know, for me, it was all about, you know, what sort of message I want to pass on to my children as and when we do have them, and you know, how does that look, and you know, what sort of life do I want to lead? What sort of things do I stand for? And I think prior to that, of course, when you're part of a group and you know, people are dependent on you, you're dependent on them, you do have an element of going with the flow. And JLS has always been, you know, a democratic group, in the sense that, you know, 3 of us want to do something, you kind of, you know, the odd one, if there is a one, is overruled, and you kind of go with the general consensus. So that makes things difficult if you really, you know, don't want to do something. But, you know, for me, it was an opportunity really to re-establish what I was passionate about and what I wanted to do, not just from a career point of view, but also from a personal perspective. And, you know, so for me, you know, I reached out to a family friend of mine and wanted to try and find like a local community, you know, a local church that I could, you know, connect with. And I had no idea where to start, to be very honest with you. At the time, you know, that was the peak of our fame. So, you know, I didn't feel comfortable just walking into any old building and not really knowing anybody, you know, not knowing whether they had, you know, good intentions in their heart or not, whether they just want me there because I'm JB or whatever, you know, and so it was a difficult period in terms of that, because it was a lot of faith, a lot of trusting, a lot of, you know, believing in other people and if they would be able to help. And, you know, I ended up meeting our pastor now. He's a pastor at Bromley Town Church, and his name was Jonathan McGill. And for those of you who don't know, the J in JB stands for Jonathan. Obviously, my last name's Gill. So that was a divine sign for me. So anyway, I spoke to this guy, and, you know, we were just talking about all sorts of stuff. You know, I wasn't married at the time, and, you know, talking about sort of JLS coming to an end, and, you know, a few things that I was struggling with or whatever at the time. And you know, it was all about really just building relationship and confidence for me personally. And we ended up obviously going there, and that became our local church. And that was really helpful for me, you know, to be able to sort of reconnect with something. Because all throughout my early years growing up, I had a huge connection to a local church, you know, whether it was with my great aunt or even locally with my family, with my mum. So, you know, I really needed to have that. And that really, I think, was the turning point. You know, us then having our children, getting married, you know, that was a real changing point for me, you know. And of course, I then became responsible. So it wasn't just about what I wanted to do all the time. You know, it was then about passing that down to the next generation.
And of course, one of the things you did do as well was become a farmer. That was a bit different, wasn't it, than being a pop star?
Yeah, well, to be honest, I mean, it's one of the reasons why, I didn't go and sort of pursue a solo career in music. Firstly, I've always loved being part of a group, and, I mentioned, being in choirs and so on, and I love that sound. But then, secondly, I didn't want anything to contradict with my... I won't say contradict my faith, because I don't think it necessarily contradicts with my faith, but, I wanted to do things which are able to accentuate that. I didn't want to have to make difficult music decisions and, have to go with any flow. I wanted it to be authentic to myself, and, I've always grown up outdoors. I grew up in the Caribbean, as I mentioned, and my dad used to keep horses and stuff like that, so that sort of rural lifestyle was very much close to my heart and something that I really appreciated. And of course we had the space, and at that time it was all about resourcefulness for me. I had about 20 acres, and, up until that point I hadn't really done anything with it, and as much as I wanted to become a full purebred farmer and just do that every single day, my wife and my family very rightly pointed out that you've just spent the best part of 10 years touring around the world and millions of people know who you are. You cannot let that slip. So it was kind of then the catalyst for a lot of my TV work, a lot of my early children's work with Down on the Farm and so on. And it's been a great source of inspiration for me, and then been, as I say, a great catalyst for all the TV work that I've done or gone on to do, whether it's in the outdoors, whether it's Springtime on the Farm, or, any of the On the Farm series that I've been doing, Cooking with the Gills. There's loads of shows now that I've done which have had that, food and farming as a foundation, and as I say, now I'm in a position where I get to choose what I do. I'm very lucky in that respect. And, I don't want anything to compromise my faith, because that's the central point of everything that I do.
And then, of course, JLS reformed. They reformed about 4 years ago. And they brought out a couple of songs, Eternal Love and also Postcard. Eternal Love was written by Ed Sheeran. Now, how did you get Ed to write for you?
Yes, a local Suffolk boy.
Local lad, tractor boy, a tractor boy.
Well, to be fair, I mean, we didn't get him to write for us specifically, but we met him a couple of times over the years, and I remember, we had a conversation with him at the Queen's Jubilee, the Silver Jubilee. The Diamond Jubilee. Obviously we were huge fans of his work, and he similarly was, a massive fan of our work, and, we do what artists tend to do. They're like, yeah, we'll get in the studio, and you're like, yeah. It never happens. But yeah, obviously, massive admirers of each other's work, and I think when we first talked about coming back and releasing new music, we spoke to a lot of the old producers that we'd worked with, obviously still working within the industry, at that time, and the guy who produced Beat Again and a couple of our other singles as well, he said, oh yeah, definitely, I'd love to work with you boys again. I'm in the studio at the moment, and we'd definitely look at seeing if we can get some stuff together, which we did. And then we didn't realize at the time he was working with Ed Sheeran, and Ed said, I've written a song for you guys, I'd love for you to hear it. And that ended up being Eternal Love, and of course we heard it, and we thought absolutely that's the perfect single for us to come back with.
And then last year, suddenly it was announced you're on Strictly Come Dancing, again something totally different. How did you get to get on Strictly?
Well, I mean, I had no idea I was doing it until the July before it all started. And again, a lot of any opportunity that I do these days, I definitely consider through prayer, obviously talk to my family, talk to my wife. And, everything that I do now, I know how much it affects not just my wife, but the family, the children as well. So, it's always a big decision. And it's not just sort of my job or my, career opportunity. It's also, theirs as well, genuinely. So, we always talk a lot in depth about it. And it's one of the things that I've always wanted to do. You saw, I think, in some of the earlier clips that I'd done the Christmas special, did that with Ola Jordan. It's a whole new set of dancers, when I've been, asked if I wanted to do it. And, for whatever reason, prior to that, it'd never been the right time, the right opportunity. Typically I tended to be busy towards the end of the year, whether I was going on tour with the boys or whatever was going on, and so it just didn't align. However, last year I was still on summer tour with the boys, and I went to sort of the audition when you go and you meet your dancer, the dancer, and then they kind of make the decision of who they want for the series. And my agent just said, would you do the show? And I was like, yeah, I'd love to do the show if it worked out. I've still got this in the diary, so, you know, we'll see. And they did the audition, all good, really enjoyed it. Then they started throwing all these dates out, and I was just like, oh no, it's going to happen again. I'm not going to be able to do it. But every single date that they'd given actually was able to work. And I was still on tour at the time, so I finished our summer tour last year, I think at the end of August. And then, of course, I was straight into rehearsals. And it was one of those things that I think just worked out. It was meant to be. And that was it, pretty much. Didn't look back.
Brilliant. And you got to the final. Now, not only are you a singer and a dancer and a presenter, you're also an author. And you've written a couple of books. So tell us a bit about the books.
Yes, absolutely. You know, it's a very proud day in my life. I've always loved English and loved writing and loved, you know, being creative with stories. And, you know, I think it's always been an extension of who I am. You know, it's one of the reasons why I think, you know, musically, songwriting and things like that have been such a huge passion of mine. And when I had Ace, who's my eldest, my firstborn, my son, you know, I even before he was born, I used to read to him in the tummy, which I absolutely loved. And, you know, I always had an aspiration to write a story that I could read with him. And so I came up with an idea to base it around the farm, you know, and just have a really fun story that, you know, kids like him could resonate with. And for one reason or another, it didn't get published in sort of its earliest forms. I remember it being, you know, I wrote sort of, you know, a couple of stories in rhyme and didn't get published, didn't get picked up. But then when lockdown came along, I spoke to a book agent, and they said they really liked the idea. They wanted to kind of go away, think about it, speak to some publishers, and then come back. And so I came up with the series, Ace and the Animal Heroes, and they basically said, am I happy to write more? And I was like, yep, not a problem. So it went from being sort of like, you know, a 14-page, 15-page picture book to being almost 30,000 words. But it was great, you know, and it was, as I say, it was great to be able to write that story. And, you know, Ace, of course, is the name of the series as well. So Ace is very happy to be, you know, have the main character named after him. Of course, that caused trouble with my daughter when she was born. So it still wasn't published at that point, so it was fine. I was able to add her in, so she's like one of the best friends in the book. And, you know, Ace and Bear, who's, you know, the character. It's not my daughter's name, but it's based on a nickname of hers. And, yeah, so they're the two main characters. And, you know, the first book is The Big Farm Rescue, which is based on, of course, as you can imagine, a farm. But Ace moves from the city to a farm, to the countryside, and has to get to, you know a new group of friends, and, you know, to help to sort of develop this farm so that it passes an inspection at the end of the book. And then similarly, I ended up writing a second book for the series, which is great. Released that last year, called The Wacky Weather Mystery, which, you know, for me, you know, I don't take for granted, you know, sort of my position. You know, there's a lot of people, I'm not the biggest farmer, I don't have the biggest farm or the most up-to-date farm or whatever, but there's lots of people who don't have the platform that I have. And, you know, I think farmers, growers, producers, you know, and our food industry as a whole, you know, needs a lot of help. And, you know, you can't fly the flag too high. You know, there's so many incredible people doing an incredible job, and we take it for granted, quite honestly. So, you know, I wanted to do something that kind of, you know, highlighted one of the biggest challenges I think we have to the farming industry, well, across the world, and that is the weather. So it's all about the weather and how the weather impacts sort of their harvest for that year. So, yeah, they were both amazing projects that I love working on, and I hope that I'm able to do more.
Now, we happen to have both books here today. If you do like to buy them, they're for really up to 10, 11-year-olds. Yeah,
I'd say if you've got a really good, keen reader, probably a 6-year-old would be able to get to grips with it. Certainly my 6-year-old couldn't, you know, well, she's 7 now, but she just turned 7, so she loves it, and she's right in a sweet spot. And I'd say, you know, obviously anyone can read it, but, you know, probably up to about 11, yeah.
So if you'd like one, I'll be over there, so will JB. They're £7.50 a book. And Unfortunately, we can only take cash or bank transfer this morning. We've lost one of our little readers, but if you do want it, come and see us afterwards. Now, also afterwards, JB will be over there. If you don't want a book, but you'd like a selfie with him, get him to sign something, very happy to do that. Because we're a little bit limited for time, we'd appreciate you making it fairly quick, so we can go through. But bits before I finish, JB, I just want to sort of pull everything together. And throughout the interview, we've talked about your Christian faith. Now, there may be people coming here this morning and thinking, well, what's this Christian faith? What does that mean?
Well, to be a Christian, essentially, is to be a follower of Christ. And we've got some very clear, depictions of what Jesus Christ is like. Throughout the Gospels, we've got, a real understanding of, the life that he led and the things that he did. And he effectively calls us to follow him. So ultimately, that's what being a Christian is. And, it's not easy, for some people who didn't grow up in church and, didn't have that foundation, that history as I did. It's not necessarily the easiest thing to get your head around. But, I think one of the things that's great, and, I can already see it just by being here for, an hour or two this morning, this is it seems like an absolutely fantastic community. You've got incredible worship. You've got some very strong leaders. It's very, very full here as well. So I think the wider community is very, very strong. And ultimately, for me, I think that's a really good starting point. And it's all about consistency. It's not easy, as I say. I've put my hands up and say, life has always been busy. I don't think it's going to get any less busy with two children who are almost busier than me now. But as I say, it's a great starting point, and just reaching out to someone who, whether it's a family member or even someone here today that you can speak to about, your faith and where you're at. I would always encourage people just to come as you are. There's no expectation. You don't necessarily have to know. In my sort of throughout my journey, one of the things that was really, really important for me was doing an Alpha course, which I did with my wife. And although at the time, I'll be honest, I didn't feel like I needed to do an Alpha course. I'd grown up in church. I could talk to you about church doctrine and all the, all the books of the Bible, all that sort of stuff, with my eyes closed. But actually, for me, it was a really important thing to do. Because it just helped to reaffirm a lot of the things that, again, you can kind of take for granted, and then also you get an opportunity to discuss, everything from the meaning of life to what the Holy Spirit is, all the different things that sort of pop up if you don't know about them, with people who perhaps don't know about them. So actually you're learning from the similar position, and then it's a chance to discuss and to talk about it. And it was great for me. My wife also comes from a Christian background, but more of a Catholic tradition, which is very different to how I grew up as, in the Pentecostal church. And, so for us both to be on the same playing field and discuss things was really, really helpful.
So obviously Alpha helped you, but what other things would you say has helped you most in your Christian walk with God?
I've touched them already. I think there's two main things that have really been incredibly helpful for me. The first thing, going back to that story, meeting the girls up in Scotland, is reading my Bible. The Bible is the foundation for God's word. So ultimately, if we want to know more about him and more about Jesus and more about how we should be and what we should be like as Christians, you have to start with that point, And I'll be honest, again, it's not easy when you're busy, especially if you've got children, you're doing stuff all hours of the day. For me personally, my children, often don't come home from school or from their activities before 9 o'clock at night. And by the time you get home, the last thing you want to do is sit and do an hour and a half of prayer and worship, because let's be honest, the kids always try and drag it out. It's not easy, but if you make that time, it's really, really important. And for me, as I say, when I'm on the road, when I'm traveling, it's a really important thing. And for those people, like similar to my wife, I'll be honest, there's people who don't particularly like reading. So then that kind of, I think in this day and age, there's so many resources out there. You can listen to the Bible on a podcast or whatever. There's loads of apps where you can do it. There's lots of different ways that you can get around that. And I think, as I say, it's an important foundation. It certainly has been for me. And then secondly, I think, is the power of prayer. And not necessarily my own prayer. Again, certainly in those early days of JLS, there wasn't much praying going on from me, that's for sure. But My family, my mum, my great aunt, absolutely, and certainly my aunt's community all around the world were praying for me, and I think it's one of the reasons why myself and the rest of the JLS boys were able to go through what can be a very difficult industry, pretty much unscathed. There weren't many sort of experiences or instances where I felt like I was in trouble. I've certainly never felt lost. And God willing, I've never been exposed to things like depression and drugs and all that sort of stuff. We've heard all the stories, and I have no doubt in my mind that is down to God's protection and over my life and via prayer through my family and through my network.
Well, JB, thank you so much for being so honest this morning and taking us through your life and taking us through your faith as well. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a big hand, Mr. JB Gill.
Thank you so much. Thank you.